I came across this quote, I think back in seminary, and I've always held on to it and probably quoted it to a bunch of college students when I work with them. It's the one from Frederick Buechner, and it says that your passion, your vocation, your calling in life is where your deepest gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So it's where your deepest gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So it's not just about what makes you glad, but there's also a deep hunger that exists in the world, and those two things come together, and that's often can form your calling. So I think that's, for me, has always been maybe a filter by which to ask people to think about their passion.
This is the Interesting Lives of Normal People. This is a particularly fun episode for me because we talk with David Burke, a pastor at a church in Sacramento, California, but he's also a former boss and a longtime mentor and friend. I've had a lot of conversations with David over the years, but to be honest, we usually just talk about me. You know, the whole mentor thing. But one thing I love about doing this podcast is that we get to put other people in the hot seat. I got to hear about his life growing up with a dad who was an atheist and a professor of philosophy at the University of Washington. We also talk about his journey of change, and we talk about one of his passion projects, supporting his wife's art business, which is really refreshing in a culture where there's a lot of misogynistic Christian leaders. David also talks about past passion projects that have succeeded and failed, and what he's learned from those experiences. We also end the conversation when he gives a glimpse into what the church could and should be. If there's a word that sums up this conversation, for me, it's refreshing. It was refreshing to be reminded that there are still good Christian leaders, and frankly, it was just refreshing just to connect with David again. I hope it's as refreshing to you as it was for me. David Burke, a pastor, a good friend. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's awesome to be with you guys.
Yeah, this is, as you know, like we are kind of endeavoring to make a podcast, making something that is useful and just, kind of giving people information and inspiration to kind of do something powerful and meaningful with their life. David and I are, I've known David for a really long time, used to work for him in a ministry out in Tennessee as when he was a college pastor. But David, why don't you just give us a little bit more of a background on who you are, kind of how you got to Sacramento, where you're living now. Just give us a little bit of a overview of, as fast or slow as you want of your life and career.
So I grew up in Seattle, Washington, was the son of a university professor and an atheist for a good chunk of my life, which I always think is kind of important to include in thinking about then becoming a pastor. But fast forward, went to a small college in California, became a follower of Christ when I was about 16 years old, tried to kind of make a faith journey happen on my own for several years, graduated from college, and started volunteering in a ministry in Seattle. And from that, got exposed to another ministry in Boulder, Colorado. Ended up going to seminary, New Jersey, Princeton Theological Seminary. And the time that I think I had growing up as a university kid and having volunteered with some college students when I was right out of college really gave me a heart for that age group, because I think like what you're talking about here on your podcast, that 18 to 22 year range of people's lives are making huge decisions about who they're going to be with, some of them for the rest of their lives, what they're going to study, what they're going to prepare for, and all that. So fast forward, finished seminary, and my first job was to this college ministry which ended up being called the House in University Ministries in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is where Jake and I met. And I just made this incredible hire when I decided to call him. It was just like incredible. I mean, the ministry's never been the same.
Yeah, I mean,
see, I don't believe that because I road tripped out to Chattanooga with him, so I know exactly who Jake was right before that.
Yeah, risky, huh?
Yeah,
it's more like it was like a prodigal son, just minus the son and prodigal part. But I mean, let's just be honest. Like, interns are important people, as I thought when I went into that job.
Some of them think they are. Yes.
Yeah.
How was it to you covered a lot of ground there up till that job between Seattle and California and New Jersey, and then starting your college ministry in Chattanooga? Was that easy? Was that hard? Just, obviously very different kind of cultures in all those different places.
The Southeast is a whole different kind of culture. And most people there grow up in, they call it the Bible Belt. And some people even call Chattanooga the buckle of the Bible Belt. And it's the really essential part of that whole culture. So I guess the best illustration I always would use with people, and I try to explain, to people where I live now, it's not uncommon there to ask somebody, in our age range, what do you do for a living? And then your second question is, where do you go to church? That's just part of the culture that exists out there. And I think it was really interesting for us. We hired a lot of interns from these kind of sister ministries of Seattle and Boulder that did not grow up in that culture. And for college students that grew up in Tennessee, to see these people that had kind of learned how to articulate and communicate about their faith in environments where it wasn't the norm was refreshing. But the South was really a pretty interesting. I felt at times a little bit like, I don't want to say this the right way, but like a missionary always studying the culture, because it was so vastly different than any other place that I'd ever lived. So there was a lot, if I could speak kind of boldly about it, there was a lot of apathy, frankly, about Christianity or following Christ, following the person of Jesus. Like it was common for us to run into students in this, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. And they lived in environments where that might be their identity, but it didn't impact what they did on a daily basis.
Yeah, it was more of a resume item than a passion or something. Yeah.
I do want to point out that I feel like you covered a lot of ground there fairly efficiently. You don't by chance publicly speak on a regular basis, do you, David?
Yes, I do. So now, if you're wanting to build a bridge to the current, after 16 years of living in Chattanooga, I was called to be a pastor at a church here called Fremont Presbyterian Church in Sacramento, and it was a draw to me because it sits one block away from a major university, Sacramento State University, which is about 30,000 students. Like I said, I've always loved university communities and kind of the questions and culture that brings, and Fremont felt like a great fit. A part of it is that it's had a long history of a people group in Ethiopia, and I mentioned that because my wife and I adopted twins from Ethiopia now 10 years ago. So we've had a heart for that country, and this church has a heart for that country. And it also has a heart for the university. So those things kind of merged together in my life and God's call, and they took a chance on a guy that never had been a pastor of a local church before.
I do, before we actually get into, I wasn't actually intending to try to go there. I do want to talk about obviously your current position and all. But something that I feel like I maybe have never talked to you about before is really just the environment of growing up in a university. I mean, your father being a university professor, atheist, even the environment that you lived in, because it was kind of interesting. Like, as you know, like you've for a long time been, if I'm honest, just a role model to me and a mentor in a lot of ways. And so it was funny, like when I moved to Seattle, actually going to your old neighborhood and being like, oh, this is where David grew up. Like and just thinking about someone who I respect so much, and just thinking about like this is where so many experiences happen. And not that your neighborhood, I'm sure it's so different now than when you grew up, because Seattle is just completely transformed in the last few years. No thanks to Microsoft. But I do think it's interesting just to think about, like, what was that environment like as a kid? Not even just being close to the university where you grew up, but like, what was it actually like being so ingrained in a scholarly environment? Or was it a scholarly environment that you grew up in? Like, what was kind of day-to-day like interaction with your dad? I mean, again, if you're okay with it, I don't think I've talked to you much about your dad.
Oh, that's good. That's good, Mike. To answer one of the questions in there, I still remember as a kid, I have an older brother who's 4 years older than me, and dinner conversations revolved around, he was a philosophy professor. So rationality, reason, and intellect, and being able to reason your way through life was one of the highest values that I remember as a kid. You needed to be able to argue your point, even at the dinner table. So intellectual pursuits would bring you, I remember just thinking and being told in either words or just what I remember picking up from my parents is like, hey, you have to do well in school. Because if you do well in school, then you'll go to a good college. And if you go to a good college, then you'll get a good job. And if you have a good job, then you'll have a good life. Like that was just how it was going to be. And ironically, we lived down the street from a Lutheran church. And I remember as a kid, my dad kind of laughing, oh, there goes crazy Lutherans. And I remember thinking that faith was intellectually weak. It was intellectually missing. Christians were people that needed some sort of crutch to lean on. So I do remember a lot of that as a kid. One of your other questions in there was, was my dad still alive? My dad passed away in 2008. And I actually brought him into the decision-making process on where to go to seminary. I felt like I wanted to respect him. He had colleagues that had actually gone to seminary in the philosophy department. So he kind of counseled me on some of that. So yeah, he did. We had interesting discussions about faith. Towards the end of his life, when I went out to go to care for him after a surgery, we had I remember him saying that the idea of faith, having faith in something, was intellectually fascinating to him. That was what he said. The idea of having faith was intellectually fascinating. He couldn't get himself there, but he found it interesting what it did for people. And he himself had grown up Catholic and I think kind of tanked all that when he went to college in the 60s. So he knew some of it, but I think kind of dismissed it completely later.
How was it? It sounds like you kind of went a different path than maybe he would have had for you with your career. How did that play out? Sort of making your own choices. Where was, I'm kind of curious for in your own mind, what did you think would happen, and then what actually did happen there?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give both my mom and dad a lot of respect because they didn't push. Like, some parents say, hey, you gotta be this, our family does this or whatever. And when I started making those choices, they never really said, no, you can't do that or anything like that. Now, they were concerned about some things, obviously. I mean, I think on one level, my dad was concerned that I was devoting my life, and he would say my intellect, to something that he found always suspect and questioned, but he never really, he always looked at some of the good things that we would do in ministry, whether it be in helping an impoverished community or those kind of counseling students. He always would kind of try to focus on the good things there, but he never really expressed a disappointment in what I chose to do. And I think I give him a tremendous amount of respect and glad about that.
That when you ultimately came to faith, did that hyper rationality lead you into any certain directions, with like apologetics or being, sometimes there are people who are so heady and intellectual and even, kind of like jerks for Jesus kind of thing, where they're going to pound you with these intellectual, these philosophical points until, people either quit or call them an a-hole and walk off. Did you find yourself like, not that that was you, but maybe like given, that sort of rationality, you have to argue your point. Was that there for you at all?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would like to say no. And this is what popped into my mind while you were asking that question. I remember as a 16-year-old, and there's a long story about how faith became real for me. And it had a lot to do with the fact that I did not see my dad living out what he preached. In other words, like, he didn't have a resource to deal with the pain that he was experiencing. Ended up in a divorce with my mom, and he, to be frank, he turned to alcohol. And I watched that when my older brother was away from college, and I remember watching that and going, wait a minute, here's this man that's preached rationality to me, and yet he's choosing to deal with the pain of his life and something very irrational, which led to a lot of irrational behavior. And that made me start asking some questions about whether what he said was real. So, just to condense that thought, somebody handed me a Gideon's Bible. I started reading it, and it was way different than what I thought. and I was introduced to the Bible through the Psalms, and that's a really interesting place to start reading about God, and it spoke to where I was at the time. But to get back to your question about apologetics, I remember this, after kind of, making a commitment and believing that Jesus was real. I'm going to convert my dad, right? Like 16-year-old, and he's got a PhD, right? And so I remember like talking to him about the existence of God and all these arguments and stuff like that. He was very patient. He listened. He goes, that argument's pretty good, but if you really want a better argument, it's this, 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 and this. And then he poked holes in all that. And I just remember my head kind of exploding and going, oh, that was a big mistake. So I think one of my first experiences at trying to be an apologetics guy was a miserable failure. And I also came to realize that in reading my dad was a Marxist philosopher, and reading some of his stuff, that one of his favorite words was esoteric, which is like, it's reserved for a few, and I also started to realize the majority of people don't live in that world. So, like you said, like apologetics is important. And I've always been drawn to Christian thinkers that have a sharp intellect and can reason and write beautifully and eloquently, but it's got to reach people. It's got to reach as many people as you can. You got to be able to write in a way or explain yourself in a way that makes sense to somebody and isn't so like isolated and, my dad's word esoteric is, it's reserved for a few.
I want to get back to kind of modern day or current day, kind of what you're doing now. You mentioned a church in Sacramento, and some of the things it's passionate about, reaching people at Sacramento State. Is that the right school? Did they say?
That's right. Yep.
And also Ethiopia as a country in general, like some of those things really. So maybe talk a little bit about the congregation itself, like the types of people that you have that actually attend. Like, what has your experience been like at this, I want to say new church, but you've been there, I guess, a while, huh?
Here's kind of the bio on Fremont. It's a 150-year-old church. It was actually started, the history says, by a couple college-age people 150 years ago that were seeing a lot of kids. This was like gold rush time, and seeing a lot of kids running around the neighborhood, and so they started a Sunday school. So Fremont kind of started from those roots, which I think is kind of interesting, and started downtown, kind of moved its way out. We're in what's called East Sacramento, and it was intentionally planted there in the 1960s by some elders when they discovered that the university was going to go there. So they intentionally wanted to be the church for the university. And for a long time, Fremont was the who's who of Sacramento. I would say now that we still have some of those folks in our midst, but that's not what we're known for, really. The people of Fremont, so there's a lot of folks, there's a lot of healthcare, a lot of folks that work for the state, entrepreneurs, students, single moms, single dads. And so it's pretty wide variety. And we have, we're our church with, I feel at times that I'm pastoring two churches. And what I mean is that we have a traditional service that meets in our 1960s sanctuary with super high cathedral kind of ceilings. And I often wear a robe, and we have a choir and an organ. And then I change clothes and I wear, a golf shirt and jeans and, Vans or something. And I go preach in a gym with a contemporary band, and people come as they are. And so it's two very different views almost of what the church is about. Maybe even different views of what I need to be and what the church should be. A lot of folks that remember when Fremont was something, and a lot of people that are like, nah, I just want to bring my kids here, and y'all have great, ministry to them. We do a lot of things in the community. We run a basketball league. We have a partnership with a public elementary school about 5 miles away from us that my wife actually is the art teacher at this school. And this school is, do you have Title I where you are? Is that a federal thing? Title I school? It usually means like a lower socioeconomic or, okay. So the elementary school where she works is a Title I school, and our church provides a grant so that they can have an art teacher. And my wife is the art teacher. So Fremont has had this cool history of really starting partnerships with People Group internationally and a school locally. And I think that's what it's known for is doing some great things in the neighborhood.
so we'd ask you, like, what are some successful passion projects you've seen from people specifically in midlife? And you kind of answered, it looks like your wife, Kelsey, around this idea of being an artist. Can you expand on like what that project looks like and what it is?
Yeah, I asked her if it would be okay. She goes, yeah, absolutely. Because I get to live with it, not with it, but I get to live with seeing this passion project come to life. So several years ago for Christmas, I think it was Christmas, I gave her her first set of pastels, and she loved it. She's always been artistic and has been able to draw and paint and all this kind of stuff, but I gave her her first set of pastels, and she just has fallen, and she has a gift for it. Does a lot of landscapes and commissions and things like that. We took one of the bedrooms in our house and we turned it into her studio. And then from there was a downtown gallery that she got to know the owner of, and they loved her work so much that they totally put all of her works in it for, I think, a month in the summer. And so I'm watching kind of her discover how to be an entrepreneur. I wouldn't call my wife midlife. That would be bad marriage advice right there, to call your wife midlife.
Late 20s.
But she's
late 20s.
I'm 50. I'm 50, and she's a few years younger than me. But we have 6 kids, and our youngest is in 3rd grade, and so most of her life, our lives together, has been she's had babies at home and full-time mom, and has been doing speaking and writing on the side. But the art has really started to take off. So even tonight was uploading videos, YouTube, online art lessons for this elementary school where she works. So she's doing speaking and writing, painting and teaching all together. So it's the season of life where she has a little bit more margin, and together we try to work out times where I have to study or times she's got to do creative work. And it's fun to watch her really live into something that she's been gifted to do and passionate about, and obviously is meeting a need for people.
That's really cool. How does it feel to have input? You understood a little bit about this passion, but to have contributed to your partner kind of really discovering this new level of passion around this with the pastels. Tell me about that and what that feels like to have contributed in that way.
I joke we do these art showings and stuff like that. And I always tell her on the way, I said, hey, I'm going to tell everybody that I'm the one that got you the first set of pastels. And I never do, but it's really a beautiful thing to see someone that you love, that's gifted, and she just comes alive and to see the joy. We have the chance when people come over and pick up their painting to see the look on their face, and sometimes it's a commission of a spot that is meaningful, like one that she just did with the wildfires out here. There was a home that was just destroyed that had been in the families in a family for about 4 generations, and she did a painting of it. And to give that to that family is just, it's kind of priceless, right? So I think it's fun for me. It was, I was putting up shelves just a couple of weekends. So I joke with her. I said, hey, you've got to get this thing off the ground so I can quit, and I'll just carry your art stuff around it, and carry your books around when you write the book. And, I'll be your book table guy when she starts. She's also a really gifted teacher and speaker, and she does a lot of women's ministry stuff here in our church. And so I just always say, hey, you write your book. She's actually is writing one. You write your book, and I'll just carry your books.
One thing that I think is really cool about this answer of what are some successful passion projects you've seen, which is, I think that, myself, you're definitely a few years ahead of, having babies. But as babies and sleep and, trying to communicate with kids that don't know how to talk, it's exhausting. Everything's messy. Not to say that having 6 kids, even being older, is not messy, but you know what I mean? It's definitely a unique part of time when you have toddlers and babies. And so much of your time is just spent on, okay, we woke up, I can't wait till we get to go back to bed.
Yep.
And okay, we have this huge thing in between the 2 sleeps that we call life, and we got to just kind of get from point A to point B. And so often we're focused on just making it to the end of the day, making it till bedtime so we can finally relax. But then for me, I look at something like this podcast, or wanting to do something meaningful and searching for something that is that searching for something that is meaningful, that makes sense, that I think I can actually contribute. But I feel like a lot of times we kind of forget, especially with, my wife is a stay-at-home mom too. You kind of forget that. I mean, selfishly, we get wrapped up so often in like, am I happy? Am I doing what I'm passionate about? And actually getting to see your wife, who really whose job in life is just being a mom, which I know they enjoy, obviously, but they have things and desires and passions. They have loves of other things and hobbies and talents that they want to express. And actually getting to see that come to life must be incredibly satisfying. I mean, even more so than finding something for yourself, I would imagine.
Yeah, it is. And I don't think she'd mind me saying that, it was fun to be, I guess, her chief encourager or cheerleader, because, fine art it's so subjective, and it's maybe hard to kind of believe. And she's never taken a class, right? So she didn't have a degree or any of that. So she'd always would be saying, yeah, I don't even know what I'm doing. I'm just painting. And yet it was always received well. But it wasn't until, I would say, maybe the last year that she's been able to say, no, I'm an artist. But before that, like, it had to be me or other people go, you're an artist. Like, look, and she, being able to show somebody. And, I'd like to, maybe this sounds like bragging, but she was away speaking, I think, on a women's retreat or something. And that was the weekend I chose to totally turn this room into a studio. I cleaned it out and bought an art desk, and I put Kelsey Burke Created, which is the name of her website, on it. And she still talks about that was a really like a vote of confidence to say, yeah, you can do this, and I want to support you.
That's a great story of having helped someone deal with that imposter syndrome concept, right? That we all struggle with, and especially trying to tackle a passion outside of our careers, because something about showing up Monday through Friday, 8 hours a day, makes it feel official, and everything else feels like we're imposters.
Yeah, that's a great phrase. And I think the other thing, going back to what you were saying, Jake, about kind of moms, especially dads too, that give up something of their identity for a season of life when kids are little, especially when I hear all these stories. And my wife has been doing this women's ministry at our church, and some of the women have talked honestly about, they've got law degrees, design degrees, they were entrepreneurs, they had their own business, and then they had kids, and all that gets put on hold. And that's it's a tough shift. It's a tough shift to give up something that you love and what you wonder whether you're ever going to get to do it again. And her getting to walk some of these younger moms through that has been really fun to see too.
It really makes you wonder why we're interviewing you and not Kelsey. Just
No, my wife, I know. She's right there.
We skipped over. You said Ethiopia and college students are passions of yours, and that helped lead you to making the choice to take the risk to move back across the country to take this job at Fremont. But I am curious about the college student passion and the Ethiopia passion, and how did you get to that place?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with the Ethiopia one first. So, a lot of times, I've never done anything like this, but when I say, oh, we have 6 kids, what's behind that story is that we actually had a lot of difficulty getting pregnant, lost a child in pregnancy. And for a season, we thought that adoption would be maybe one of the only ways that we would have children. We did have a child. Our oldest son, Hudson, is now 19. Jake, if you could believe that, he's 19 years old. But we had a season where we really were looking at adoption. And so I'll tell you the story because I think it speaks to some other passions that might come out later. So I remember we went to an adoption agency in Chattanooga, and they handed us 2 notebooks. This was like an introductory kind of thing, just to explain the process. And I still remember they handed us 2 notebooks, and one was pretty thin, and one was pretty thick. And opened them up, and the thin one were all of the Caucasian babies, and there were not that many that were available for adoption. And to that they said, yeah, the waiting earliest time for a Caucasian baby would be about, I think they said something like 2 years. And then and we said, well, what's this other notebook? And the other notebook were black and biracial babies, tons of all ages. And they said, and the waiting time there is about 6 to 9 months. And I remember that situation and going, wow, there's a sad reality there. And that became, I think that was one of our first thoughts for us about entering into adopting a child from a different culture or a different race. Jake, were you on staff when we went then to, I think you were, when we went to the Willow Creek conference where Bono spoke?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You remember that?
Yep.
And he spoke about Africa. That Kelsey and I still talk about that as being one of the places where Ethiopia got on our radar, because we learned at that point the number of orphans that were in Ethiopia. So, fast forward, it was a longer process. We started reading New York Times bestseller books about Ethiopia and the situation there, whether it was not just children that were orphaned because of AIDS, but famine, civil war, all kinds of things. And our heart just was tugged for that country. I can't explain it really. So we adopted our twins. Their names are Simone and Justice. We brought them home when they were 18 months old, and they turned 11 this past February. And so to tie in the call to Fremont, it was really, people throw this around a lot, but I'm just going to say it was kind of one of those God things where God only knew the elements of my story. And then when I see this description, I still remember the first few lines were like, Fremont Presbyterian Church is looking for a senior pastor to preach and teach and shepherd the staff. And that was something that some people that I've been working with were saying, hey, those are who you are. And then it said, we sit at the gate of Sacramento State University. We've had a 20-year partnership with Ethiopia, and we run this community basketball program. That was all like in the first few sentences. And as Jake could attest, there was the college element. I always wanted to work for a university church, the Ethiopia piece. And then I was accused of playing an enormous amount of basketball with college students when I lived in Chattanooga. So here was this whole thing of the description of like, we're a block away from a university. We have a partnership with Ethiopia, and we run a basketball program. It's like,
that's the top three things. That's
actually,
I believe this is true, Jake. Playing basketball in Chattanooga is where, I know that's where you tore your ACL, but also that's where you learned you're athletic.
Well, that's where I was running. My parents came to visit, and I was just playing intramural football, and I was just running on the field, and they're like, wow, we didn't know you could run so fast. I'm like, wow, it's not like it's fast, but I can run.
But I think I remember you talking about going out there and playing pickup basketball and sort of discovering you were better at basketball than your self-identity was about you as a basketball player. And it was sort of out in Chattanooga is where you started to realize that you'd always compared yourself to your older brothers and hadn't really allowed yourself to discover if you were athletic yourself.
Yeah, it's where I discovered my inner Dennis Rodman. Just go get that ball. Yeah. Go get it.
There was a little of that in you, wasn't it?
Yeah. There was some
minus the nose ring and tattoos.
That's Vegas included.
So on the college student passion front. Sorry, go ahead, Finn.
Yeah.
I just said Vegas included though.
That's
Love Vegas.
That's a Last Dance reference, basically.
Yeah. So David, you've seen in the passion projects you've seen, whether that's with your wife or any number of things that have happened in your ministry or church or wherever. What makes these passion projects soar and what makes them fail?
I think when I look at some of the things of me trying to cast vision, but I also see this with others as well, that sometimes the folks that have vision or ideas are not the ones that can incrementally bring about the changes that are needed to make that vision happen. Like you need good partners, you need a good team. I was talking to, the guy that I worked with for 10 years at the house in Chattanooga, Jason, that Jake also worked with, who's now the director of the house. And I remember talking to him just this past year, and he said he knew that always his role was to help translate what I had come back from some conference or my doctoral classes or reading some book. His job was to translate it into the college student life and how it would play out actually in the ministry. And without him, I would, a lot of these things that we did would not take root. Same thing with Kirsten. Kirsten had a remarkable ability to take these kind of ideas and vision and concept and translate it. So I think that's one thing, is that you got to have good people around you. If you're not a good strategic thinker, a good strategic planner who could see the steps that need to happen to make something a reality, I think that's one crucial part. This one is maybe more particular to the doctoral project that I did, which was about the church being an entrepreneur in its community. And in short, it was trying to see if the church, not just a local church, but the church, a faith community, combining its resources to put a grocery store in a food desert. That was my doctoral project in Chattanooga. But I know that what failed in that is that there were some powers and systems that had been created over time. And so when you're dealing with a street that's a quarter mile from downtown and you want to put a nonprofit in there, there are some forces and systems that would like to make some more money off of that than your little nonprofit. And ultimately, a lot of that vision, I think, the politics of that area, the financial gain that was going to be realized by some developers, people protecting the real estate. That's what I think in my case made that fizzle out.
I do want to get down to this question about your doctorate. And if you could explain a little bit more about this project that did fail, can you tell us what you were attempting to do?
Yeah, so I was taking these classes out at Fuller Seminary in California, and a lot of it was on the church as mission, re-envisioning the church as an entity and a community that actually looks at the needs of the community around it, the neighborhood around it, and seeks to meet those needs. I mean, that was the earliest part of our history as followers of Christ, is whether it be hospitals or schools or things like that. So it's trying to recapture some of that identity of the church. And what I was seeing happen in Chattanooga was that you had this university community that was merging into a historic African-American neighborhood, the Martin Luther King Boulevard area. And as I began to talk with longtime residents of that neighborhood and city councilmen, that it was a food desert. I mean, if you're familiar with that term, there was no access to fresh produce or a grocery store in a 1 mile radius around that. And what I knew from talking, and I began to do research with grocery store owners, is that no big box grocery store was going to touch that neighborhood, because it was the profit margin already is in a grocery store is slim, and you have college students, little disposable income, and a lower socioeconomic group, with a developers thought, probably not a substantial profit to be made there, but a nonprofit whose bottom line, or it wasn't just about the bottom line. And the church often will do things not for the money, hopefully, and so the idea was to think about, well, how could you mobilize the resources in the church to actually invest in a neighborhood like that? And so my paper was called The Entrepreneurial Church, Mobilizing the Church to Bring Restoration to a Neighborhood in the Martin Luther King Jr. District. And I, in preparation for this podcast, I went on Google Maps today, and I don't know when it was last updated, but largely that street is still the same, except a developer did go and buy a chunk right off of the boulevard and build student housing behind it. But there's still no grocery store. There's some restaurants that looks like it really caters to the college students, but that's also could be a gentrified kind of neighborhood now, where the predominantly African-American neighborhood still is not, the needs of the neighborhood are not being met there. So the idea was to try to rally foundations, churches, instead of building more buildings for themselves, to build a building for a neighborhood in need.
So is this kind of an entrepreneur? I mean, I know you're saying entrepreneur, but in a ministry attempt, an outreach attempt, that you were trying to actually get funding. You were actually trying to build a brick and mortar store
Yep.
Was that also part of your doctorate, or did you write your doctorate about that experience?
Yeah, the doctorate was probably, or the paper was more about the experience.
Okay.
But I did like take a business class on how to run a business plan. I was meeting with city council and local foundations, and ultimately it became clear that the foundations and some developers had some other ideas for the neighborhood. So that ultimately won out.
So I have 2 follow-up questions. First, how did you notice that was, how did you get that idea to begin with? Like, what made you actually notice that? Because I feel like that's something that myself, I'm driving around, I don't really pay attention. I mean, I can tell when I'm in a lower economic status neighborhood, but I never look to think, oh, where's a grocery store? That's just not something that I would notice. So I'm curious, like, first of all, how did you notice that? And then secondly, when things actually didn't come together as you'd hoped, was that crushing? Like, what was that experience like to see something that you really hoped would make a difference in people's lives not come to fruition? Like, what did that do to your drive to continue on, or maybe to try, project number 2?
Yeah, that's great. Great question. So the first question, how did I notice? Literally, I drove down the street every day on my way to work. That was my exit. That was I drove down ML King Boulevard, and Chattanooga has even developed more since I left. But you leave downtown, which has kind of been totally refurbished, and Chattanooga's featured as this city that has kind of moved from an industrial to a technology and tourism town. So you leave downtown.
Fastest internet in the country.
Yeah, that's right. So you leave downtown, and literally within 3 blocks, you're on ML King Boulevard, and it's boarded up buildings, empty lots, and then I would take a left turn to go to the office, and in a block, I'm hitting the brand new apartment style dormitories for UT Chattanooga, and the contrast between all of it is just like, oh my gosh, like, what's the deal with this street? And it's hard not to notice. And at the time, some of the reading that I was doing, there's this passage in the prophet Isaiah that talks about the people of God will be called the restorers of city streets. And so when you begin reading that kind of stuff, and then you're driving by it every day, you start going, wait a minute, maybe the goal of the church should be a restorative one, and it should be recapturing that identity of restoration of a neighborhood. And that's where, and it was about that time that this concept of food deserts and healthy food, and hey, whole populations of people should not be getting their food from the gas station, and so all of that kind of merged together simultaneously. How did it feel about how it kind of, it still has that, like, man, I wish it could have. I wish what if I had, for instance, stayed in the community, that there's a community where there's such longevity of generations that people that live there, that if you're in a particular family, or you have access to families like that, there's stuff that can get done. But it became really clear. There's 2 things I think I learned. One, outsiders in a long-standing community have a hard time getting things done. Like, if you're from there, you have a natural in. But I was this kid from Seattle doing college ministry, which people didn't really understand in a church culture anyway. So that was kind of maybe one strike against me. The second one was is that there's a whole chapter in my doctorate about how the language of church and the language of business don't get along very well. The churches don't want to be a business, and business certainly doesn't want to learn anything from the church, and it's vice versa. And so I had a hard time convincing faith-based communities that a church could actually start a business and it would be a part of their mission. And one illustration of that is, as I would present this to different groups of church leaders, they would then say, okay, so I get the idea of the grocery store, but when are you going to start the church? And what they meant was, when are you going to start a worship service? Because that's really what the church does. Does that make sense? Like what they would say back to me was like, okay, it's great that you want to help provide people with food and all this kind of stuff, but but when are you going to plant a church? And I would go, no. See, we're being the church by doing this.
Were they trying to pigeonhole you, or were they trying to investigate your motives?
I think all the above. I think that they could go, oh, okay, so here's this at the time, young college minister. Yeah, we could see him being a church planter. Yeah, that makes sense to us. And then, but I think that they really didn't understand what I was talking about. Like, and I would have to say, I'm not talking about starting a worship service, but in that era, this was some time ago. In that time, church equals a worship service where people can make decisions to follow Christ. And that's what the real work of the church is. So you can, in a conservative Christian mindset, sometimes all you have to do is say something like, oh, that sounds like social gospel, and meaning like a gospel that actually has social implications to it, and it can get written off really quickly if you're in a certain camp. And I think a lot of the folks that I was talking to were in a certain camp. They were like, okay, but evangelism, like, tell me about how you're going to evangelize people, or when are you going to start the worship service, and didn't see the possible beauty that could come out of providing jobs and restoration to a community. I think we're actually in a different place now, where we're all starting to realize, yeah, that's probably what the church needs to be doing right now, because I don't know about where things are and where you all live, but people aren't flocking to worship services right now.
Yeah, this might be a, tell me if I'm crazy, or this might be a leap from what you're saying, but I'm interpreting what you were saying through a lens of a few things I've been thinking about, which it sounds like what you're saying is there's this historically, or at least recent history, there's an expectation of the church as kind of just like a box check scenario. So congregants check the box by going to church on Sunday. Pastors check the box by doing a worship service, doing an altar call, inviting people to Jesus, and everybody did their thing. God's going to pat them on the back when they get to heaven, and the results or the outcomes aren't really that important ultimately. I mean, they hopefully it does well, but really for me, it's about checking the boxes I'm supposed to check. And you're saying, well, what if we take those lead metrics that, like, I had a worship service, I went to church on Sunday, and you kind of scrambled those up and focused more on the lag, like more on what would it look like to put those in the far away outcome, like people, seeking after a church, to find a church after they've been served in all of these other real important ways, like, a place to learn, a place to find people that were investing in them, a place for,
stability.
Food, stability, yeah, good, healthy food, all those sorts of things. All these change what the lead metrics are to helping people with these things. And then the lag metrics can become like, hey, by the way, where do you, you guys that, help me get healthy food every week, where do you guys go to church or whatever?
Yeah. I understand what you're saying there. And in a lot of cases, that is the kind of the long game of like, okay, so this group of people actually are tangibly showing that they care for me, my family, my children, my needs, and they're doing this and not necessarily expecting something in return. If I could, we're not packaging the bread and putting a tract in it, right? We're just selling bread. It's not a bait and switch kind of thing. Like, hey, you've got it. We're going to sell you this food, but then you've got to come to our.
Right.
It's not that, but we trust that over time. Yeah. We're going to love people, and then they might, begin to. I was looking back at my doctoral paper, and I don't remember this that well, but I was like, wow, that's interesting. This theologian named Karl Barth, who wrote a long time ago, and he talked about when you actually love people, people will naturally begin to wonder about the source of that love. So when you actually do it with integrity, and because you actually care for the person and not for an ulterior motive, Bart's argument was that, oh no, they'll wonder about the source of the love. So you don't have to worry about that. So, I think that we and the church have either relegated ourselves, society has relegated themselves, or relegated the church to, a big thing in California is that it's non-essential, or a non-essential kind of thing right now. But I think I think the other factor too is that we live in a world where words are super cheap.
Mm-hmm.
And if the church is just known for a word message and not a tangible message of another kind, we're missing something.
Mm.
And one of the other books that I referenced in the research was a book by Gabe Lyons called The Next Christians, and he talks about this research that shows, hey, the deeds that you do, the actions that back up mean so much in this generation of people, because words are cheap. Everybody's saying a bunch of stuff. So what's true? Well, it's when the words and the actions line up.
Especially in the political climate we're at, so often what I hear from especially conservative Christians is that the battle is to preserve like Christian rights and Christian what they hold sacred. Now, in Christian freedoms, and I totally understand that is an important. I understand why that is important to people, but at the same time, I'm like, that's just like giving up freedoms was something just much more common in the early church. Like giving up freedoms and like focusing on, hey, I got to preserve my freedoms. That just doesn't really exist. But yet it seems like we are so often, this is probably nothing new. I'm just getting old enough to recognize that it's just so common. But that is just so prevalent in our culture, which is Christians just wanting to do everything they can to preserve their freedoms. And like, there are things that could be voted on the Supreme Court or laws that can be passed that I might not disagree with, but I guess my problem is that but is that where I should expend my energy in my battle, is like fighting to keep those things that I hold sacred, or is it to actually reach the people and make a difference, like you said, bring life to the streets around me instead of just like fighting a political battle? I don't know if I have an actual question about that, but first of all, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And how would you respond to that sentiment?
So here are some of my thoughts. Is that I think that there are scriptures and teachings that exhort us to lay down our sense of freedom or rights for the benefit of another. And not to dive into what might be a controversial topic, but I'll share with you how our church has approached this whole COVID-19 stuff. So I've been teaching our church out of books of the Bible that talk about us being in exile. Well, what did people like Daniel and Nehemiah do in exile? They worked within the foreign government system that they were in, and God still brought about change in the midst of that. So there are a lot of churches that have chosen to rebel against the current authorities for a variety of reasons, and usually it's the argument about freedom and rights. But I've encouraged our church, and our elders are with us on this, to say there's also another way. There's another way to exist within the county and state guidelines and work within and work as a partner for the city, to seek the welfare of the city and abide by these kind of guidelines. That does mean a feeling like we're losing our freedom. I think that this is my opinion. I think that some of the talk about losing our rights and our freedom is that people are fearful because they already see the proverbial kind of writing on the wall that the church has lost its influence a lot over the last decades. And so we're waning already in our influence. And so it just feels like, oh, here's another attack. And if this goes, then what's next, right? So, but instead, what if we, instead of fighting for those things, we begin to love our city well, seek the welfare of the city, as it says in Jeremiah, be a restorer of the city's streets, so much so that the community doesn't want you to leave. Could it get to that point where, because we're the ones that's supporting the school with art and music, we're the ones that's providing stuff for students and communities and all the rest, that you almost don't want, that the community would say, oh, that would be a tragedy if that church left.
Yeah, I love that perspective. And I think that idea of like, if you're persecuted, especially for doing the right things, like that's the kind of the point, right? Like Jesus was persecuted, so you're going to be persecuted.
Yeah.
And when they put you out, they're going to be, thinking they're doing it for the right reasons, but you're the one who's following me. And it feels to me like in some ways the American Christian has gotten so enamored actually with the power that identity held. And now that is slowly, you pointed out, it's like the air is slowly seeping out of that balloon. Now there's a loss of a lot more than just, a court case or something like that. It's like, it is literally, I am becoming the lesser in a society where I've always been the greater. And for some reason that, although it's like totally counter to the narrative of the Bible, that's a position that the American white evangelical church, I think, has gotten very comfortable in. So this is just me editorializing, but I think if anything, the church is going to be refined over time by some of this, like this necessary loss of, or I don't say necessary loss, but it's going to be refined by people falling away, people leaving the church who don't see the church being what it says it was or said it should be, and by the people who are still there being shown, maybe in some cases, to be humble and servant-like and willing to, as your church is, I think, be a light in the community, and others will be shown for the power hungry, the power brokers, the people who maybe, I don't know, might have been some in Chattanooga who might have other motives. So that's Finn Says. It's a new segment of the podcast. Finn Says.
I like that.
I do want to be respectful of your time, David. There are two questions I at least want to get to, and they're Finn's second, like 8th and 9th question. Finn, do you want to maybe get into that number 8?
Yeah, David, as we've been exploring passion projects, I've liked to ask almost all of our guests about where they think this thing comes from. Is it innate? Is it something that we just get from this culture that we live in? And I think sometimes there's this notion that it's kind of this like Maslow hierarchy, self-actualization, and it's for these people who have so many levels of security that now I can sit around and think about what to do with a couple hours of my day, or I can sit and think like, oh, do I like my life, or am I totally fulfilled 8 hours a day in my job? Is it that? Is it just that we have the blessing of time and margin, and that's why we're talking about these things and thinking about these things? Or is it's actually something that's a deeper part of who we are and how we're made to be, that it just can't help but come out of us, and that even maybe a different time in history or with a different set of circumstances, that fire would still be burning. So I'd love to hear you, as somebody who studied history and but also from a spiritual and a philosophical lens. Has this been with us all along? Is this innate, or is there something more, I don't know, just about the time and place of history that makes these passion projects a thing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I don't know if it's always been with us. But I think what I do think is that I believe that we are created in the image of God, and some of what that means is that God has endowed us with the ability to be creators, to be as He created, that we also are stewards of and creators of new things within that creation. And I do believe that we're also uniquely made. But I think that good part can easily get corrupted in, frankly, a North American individualistic society that also kind of preaches, hey, do what you feel, and whatever you feel is important, and as you, that's like what you feel is really you. I mean, that's kind of boils down some of that message. I mean, I don't know if it's as simple as that, but I think it is some of that your feelings about certain topics or about who you are, no one should take that away from you. And that's who you are. And I think that can be dangerous. And so, I think that when you talk about passion projects, I think that we need to define what we mean by passion. because I look at my own like kind of college experience. I came in, I really loved technical drawing, and I thought I wanted to create. I wanted to be an architect. And because I was really smart and 17 years old, I chose a college with no architecture program. And then my sophomore year, I started taking psychology classes, and I was fascinated by it because this is about what motivates people and what people experiences impact them. And so I thought I was going to be a counselor. And then my junior year, I thought, oh, advertising, because advertising uses motivation of people, and you get to do creative things with selling stuff. And then my senior year, I was like, yeah, I don't think I could sell stuff my whole life, to people that they don't really need, just convince them that they need it. And I had a kind of a moral issue with that. So nothing against people in advertising, but that's just, so in 4 years, my passions changed 4 times. And I think that one of the blessings that a community of faith, a church could be, is to actually help people discover their passions. We obviously see in our culture right now, there's this real fascination with personality tests, whether it's on Facebook or whatever, strengths finders and Enneagram and all that stuff. And I think all of it is trying to say, hey, yeah, we are made a certain way. But the danger of those tests is that it becomes a label, and it doesn't take that more theological belief that says, well, but we're also being changed. Like each and every day we're being changed. So yes, we might have some certain characteristics or giftedness, but it doesn't pigeonhole us or lock us into something forever, because we are to be changed as well.
One of the things I've seen from those personality tests is I think people see it as a way of understanding themselves, and like, oh, I see, I do that. And it's nice to see an explanation behind it that kind of makes sense. And so I think it's partially, yes, then it becomes a label where now people feel like they can't be different than that if they don't totally align. But there's also this, I don't feel seen even by me. And those things help kind of shine a mirror.
I came across this quote, I think back in seminary, and I've always held on to it and probably quoted it to a bunch of college students when I worked with them. It's the one from Frederick Buechner. And it says that your passion, your vocation, your calling in life is where your deepest gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So it's where your deepest gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So it's not just about what makes you glad, but there's also a deep hunger that exists in the world, and those two things come together, and that's often can form your calling. So I think that's, for me, has always been maybe a filter by which to ask people to think about their passion.
You've mentioned a few times you mentioned where you went to school. I just want to make sure that I understand. You played soccer in college.
1 year.
1 year. And you also were a kicker on the football team. Am I right? 1
year.
And you also got injured when you were kicking.
Yes. Why is this relevant to? Is this about failed passion projects? Is it? Yeah.
So just
another thanks. And just dig that up. Another failed passion project.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Boy. Wow. Get Kelsey on.
So that's why you brought me on.
Yep.
Oh, here's the guy that has failed at more passion projects than anybody else we've ever talked to.
You made a lot of bad decisions. It's okay. I can
think of one right now. I can think of one I just made like not too long ago at about 8 p.m. my time.
Yep. More to standard questions. Of course, we can list these in the notes for the episode. What are some books you recommend that may or may not be related to this topic, but what are some kind of resources? And then kind of the second part of the question, exercises, tools, practice that you find helpful. So books and then exercises and tools.
Yeah. So this is going to be no surprise to you, Jake. I think that anything by Dallas Willard is a wonderful re-envisioning of really what a life of following Jesus is like, and how much he talked about the kingdom of God, and what that's really what Jesus was inviting us into. Wasn't just a ticket to heaven. But I think and Willard actually writes a lot about, he's got whole works on God and business and the impact that faith has in your work and entrepreneurship and all that kind of stuff. So I think anything by Willard, I'm a huge fan. When I was talking about the doctoral project earlier, a really important work for me was a book by a guy named John Perkins, who's extremely well respected in the community development world, restoring at-risk communities. And just a quote that he said: in the mission of the Messiah, the mission of Jesus, and our mission is not complete until we've empowered those living in devastated spaces in the ruined cities to restore and rebuild their own community. The exercise, this is a personal one for me. I always want to be learning, so continuing to learn, and there's so much content out there. But recently I took a class. My son's going to the University of Virginia, and they let parents take classes online. So I took a class in their business school on design thinking, which is really kind of a human-centered approach to problem solving in business and in other areas. And it's amazing how much it applied to my work as a pastor.
David, this has been really, really good. It's really refreshing to chat with you and hear you. And again, as someone who's been a mentor for a long time, even from a distance, it's refreshing just to hear you talk, just refreshing to hear your thoughts, refreshing to joke around with you a little bit. So thank you for taking the time to do this. This is incredibly meaningful to me personally, and just incredibly excited about this. And so I can't wait to kind of put this all together and listen to it again. So thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, until next time.
Thank you, guys. I loved it.
Yeah.
Hit that outro music.
Outro.
Thanks for listening to The Interesting Lives of Normal People. If you liked what you heard, we'd really appreciate giving us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts and telling your friends. It really helps new people find us. Remember that David's wife, Kelsey, has an art business. You can find her art at kelseyburkeart.com. And thanks again to Hugo for letting us use her music in this episode. You can find more of her music on SoundCloud.